And at 13 minutes to 10, you're listening to Manx Radio on 188 meters in the medium wave, 89 and 91.2 in the VHF band. And our guest this evening is Dougie Faragher, who is sitting there relaxed on about his second or third cigarette this evening. Doug, you seem, when talking about the Manx language, to come to life. It seems to it sparks something off in you.
Well, it's a subject I hold very dearly. I think it's something worth preserving, and nothing annoys me more than to hear a Manxman, a true-born Manxman, saying, "What do you want to preserve that rubbish for?" Because 9 times out of 10 they don't know what they're talking about. And the new residents who come to the island make up quite a large number of our students and even teachers of the language, strange to say. The Manx have an inferiority complex about their own nationality and their language. This started, as I mentioned before, about the time of the 1870 Education Act. If the scholars of the world could pick up a record or a tape recording of the Etruscan language of Italy today, there would be cries of delight all over the academic world. Manx is one of the oldest languages in Europe, and it's not just the language of a little rock in the Irish Sea. It's part of the great Gaelic group. It's spoken by about 3 million people, the language which we call Manx. The only thing is that Manx is slightly different from Irish and Scottish Gaelic, but the 3 of them are mutually intelligible and were once the language of most of Britain. The whole of Ireland, Scotland and Man, and right down into Northumbria, and into parts of Cumberland, people spoke nothing else but Gaelic. And I found it very interesting. It's been a far more use to me, say, than French. I learned French at school, and I got a few what they might call O-levels today, one of which was French. I spoke French once to an Arab over the side of a troop ship in the Suez Canal. And when my wife and I were married, we went to Paris on our honeymoon. I spoke a bit of French there, and I spoke a bit of French in the Congo when I lived in Africa, and that's about all. And people say, why don't children learn a European language? A major European language is far more use to you than something so parochial as Manx. But French, to me, has never really meant much, and it doesn't to any Manx child unless they become an interpreter or work in an office which is dealing with France, whereas Manx has been a constant joy to me almost every day of my life.
There is you mentioned Manx inferiority, but is this particularly Manx, or is it an inferiority that runs right throughout the Gaelic communities? Because I seem to notice a similar sort of thinking frequently in Scotland or Ireland or Cornwall indeed,
yes,
or even parts of Wales, especially the southern parts.
Yes, it's not really a Manx inferiority complex. I perhaps shouldn't phrase it that way. It's a Celtic inferiority complex. You see, the Celts were conquered by the Saxons and driven to the west, and they eventually began to believe that everything Saxon was better than their own, and the language in Ireland and Scotland was also on the point of extinction, particularly in Ireland until the 1870s, when the Gaelic League was founded by Dr. Douglas Hyde. Everyone confidently expected that Irish would be dead by about 1910 or something like that. Of course, it hasn't happened. And everyone expected Manx to be dead by about 1920, but it didn't happen either. So we've managed to keep it alive, and the old native speakers gave us a charge. They used to say to us, "Freili bio," which means keep it alive. And that's what we're trying to do.
I notice you mentioned the Irish language, but the Gaeltacht areas seem all on the west coast, the farthest part away from the United Kingdom.
Yes, that's
in
right.
remote areas.
Yeah.
Do you think this has got anything to do with the fact that it has survived in Ireland because of that?
Yes, this is why it has survived, because of the remoteness from London, one might say. But even the Gaeltacht areas in Ireland are losing ground, and the language is losing ground, and in Scotland it only really survives in the Outer Hebrides. And the Celtic languages are, I'm afraid they're doomed eventually. Of course, all languages are doomed eventually, though. President Carter has just sent the space shot up, and Onity has a record saying that the world is still divided into nations. and sent messages in various languages. I suppose someday there will be a world language. Of course, English speakers feel that will be English, but we often say to them, well, what about the Chinese and the Russians?
And the French wouldn't agree with you
The
there.
French certainly wouldn't agree with it.
There is an argument about Gaelic that says that why bother to learn a language so that you can converse with somebody passably when you already know one in which you can converse with them a great deal better. Is there a reason other than an academic reason, do you feel, for learning Gaelic? You've put a sort of a nationalistic point of view forward, and you've also at the same time indicated that perhaps a lot of the people who should have this inbuilt nationalism haven't. So if that is the case, where do you see the reason for keeping the language going?
Well, the reason is that it's Manx and we are Manx and we live in the Isle of Man. That's the only reason. One can converse in Manx about anything that you can converse about in English, especially today when we have a modern vocabulary in the process of formation, a modern dictionary. And I would dispute really that you can speak, that it's a waste of time. You see, English-speaking people cannot understand bilingualism, and it's bilingualism that we are really aiming at. We don't wish to make the Isle of Man a Manx-speaking community. That's an impossible dream. It's bilingualism whereby we could speak Gaelic ourselves, and when a visitor asks you where the post office is, you say, well, it's in Regent Street, just round the corner, as they do in Wales. It's a nation without a language is no nation at all, and we believe that there is such a thing as a Manx nation. If there's not, then it's a waste of time learning Gaelic.
I have noticed when I've had similar conversations with other people where I've been adopting your stance, because I'm playing devil's advocate slightly tonight, their argument has always been, well, why not concentrate on a language that is of some use? They make reference to Russian or German or various other languages. And I seem to feel that this really means, why not learn a language which is of some use in perhaps making money?
Yes, well, that's probably the motive behind saying that. But as I explained with my French, for instance, it was never much use to me. I can still understand a French news broadcast, just about. But that's all the use has ever been to me. But Manx is, it's the key to all our place names, our personal names. If you go past a farm called Ballawully Killier, you know that it means the farm of the church enclosure and this sort of thing. It means something to a Manx person to be able to use Manx. I think so, anyway. Because we are in a minority, very much so, in the island.
Well, I think what we'll do is, afterwards, I'd like to ask you some more about the how one can learn it. And your dictionary. You've mentioned a dictionary, you said, but in fact, you modestly neglected to say that it was your dictionary that you've been working on for the past, how long?
About 25 years, quarter of a century.
So I think we'll look into that as well. Now let me remind you, with the time at 5 to 11, we'll have the news at 11 o'clock, and then we'll be back with Doug. In the meanwhile, a little music. Doug, you've just had a lady on the phone whilst the music was playing, a Mrs. Blunt, who's listening in Port Erin. And I'm using Mrs. Blunt's own words, so I'm sure she won't take me to task when she says that she's a come-over. And she feels that we should, here in the Isle of Man, keep as many things that are Manx as possible, including the language. She doesn't want to see the Isle of Man slipping into the sea and becoming another part of the European blob, I think was the way that she was thinking.
Part of Cumbria.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, well, this is, I'm very pleased to hear that, because this bears out what I told you, that so many of the new residents in the island, we don't call them come-overs in Manx, we call them Cumulty No, which means the new ones who live here. They are, in many cases, much more enthusiastic about Manx things in general, not only the language, but everything Manx, and they come here to live in an island, usually because they like the place, they love the place, and they don't want to change it. This is not to say that people who speak Manx don't want change. We don't want to live in thatched cottages with a tithe egg at the bottom of the garden. But we feel that Manx, everything Manx is worth preserving in this modern world where everything is becoming more uniform. I think a patchwork quilt is much more interesting to look at than something grey. It'd be terrible if all the daffodils and bluebells and roses were all grey, wouldn't it? Everything is different. People are different. We can all live together in harmony, and just because one speaks Gaelic doesn't mean to say that one is an Anglophobe. Not by any means.
Do you think it is possible in Europe as it is today to become part of the European picture and still develop this strong sense of cultural identity?
Yes, I think so. It does exist in Europe already, and there's no reason why we couldn't be part of Europe and yet be Manx, although it would become progressively difficult, I should imagine, as we move towards the United States of Europe, which is the eventual aim of the EEC. However, that's all for the future. As President Carter said, as I mentioned before, we are still divided into nations and races, and are going to be for a very long time. So, therefore, if we're Manx, let's be Manx. That's all I say. And by all means, have our tourist industry and be courteous to the visitors and have English friends. But we mustn't let them superimpose their culture and everything on us to the detriment of our own.
Tell me, have you had any experience or any discussions with the people, the Corsicans or the Friesians or the people who live in Brittany, who I'm sure must be suffering similar problems?
Yes, especially with the Bretons. We have quite a contact with the Bretons through the medium of the Celtic Congress, and of course the French are well-known linguistic imperialists, and they treat Breton far worse than Gaelic and Welsh was ever treated by the British government, but it survives. The Friesians are fighting a losing battle. As I said earlier on, I think all minority languages are eventually doomed, but not just for the time being. Not in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, I don't think so.
Well, let's look now at a means perhaps of making sure that the Manx language is not doomed for a while, and people who wish to learn it. Now, do you find, I know that you teach it, do you teach it up at the college?
I have been teaching at the College of Further Education, yes. I'm not teaching this winter. I did last winter, yes.
Well, do you find that in the classes that were there were mainly people who are, what was the word again for new arrivals?
Pardon?
What was the word again for new arrivals?
Commonty-no.
Yeah.
No, they weren't actually. There were some new arrivals there. There were some Manx people there, yeah.
Now, the people who turn up to these classes, are they people who are used to an academic background?
No, they're not. No. This is one of the difficulties being a teacher of a language. I would say 95% of them are not from an academic background. But of course we teach Manx today in a modern method. We don't drone verbs like we used to at school when I was a boy. We now teach the language in large lumps, whole sentences, drum them in and into them again and again with the use of a little book called Bunadus, which means the basis. That's one of the best methods of learning a language. That's how a child learns a language, by hearing sentences spoken and repeating words and eventually sentences. And it's amazing, after a winter session there, some of them have quite an extensive vocabulary. Some people simply come along to satisfy a curiosity about the language and then they drop out after a short time. Others go on to become teachers of the language.
How many would you say, or would you say the dropout rate is high? How many go into the second year and on to the third? Or for that matter, how many come back into the first year again?
Well, the College of Further Education discourage them from going back into the first year again. I'd say about 50% go on to the second and third year, and of that, you could say most of that 50% eventually become speakers of the language. It's amazing. I've met young men recently who have spoken quite good Manx to me, and I don't even know them. Now, this
It's a good sign.
This couldn't have happened 20-odd years ago when I first started learning. We were a little tight, almost elite group of about a dozen people who spoke the language fluently. Now I meet people and I nearly fall over backwards because they speak Manx to me, and they learnt it in some other class somewhere that I didn't even know existed.
If people don't know you, how do they know you can speak Manx?
Well, we wear the fáinne, as we call it. It's a little gold ring which we wear in our lapel, which signifies to all the Gaelic-speaking world that we speak the language and would like to be spoken to in that language if possible. Of course, in the island, one eventually gets to know everyone, but it does happen that people have spoken to me and I didn't know them.
When you're wearing this emblem, perhaps, and you're in Scotland or Ireland, and somebody comes up to you and speaks to you in their version of Gaelic, how readily can you understand them?
Oh yes, you can understand them all right. In Dublin particularly, a lot of people speak Irish to you when they see them wearing the fáinne, and if they go a bit fast, you just say "She mananach mish." You see, it's a Manxman I am, and of course the first thing they say in Irish is, "Oh, we didn't know there was any Gaelic still alive in the Isle of Man." They don't know in Ireland either that Manx exists. It's incredible, really. They think that we are only sort of kippers and candy floss here in the island now, and that our culture has disappeared. And they get quite a surprise to hear Manx spoken, and they're very surprised that they can understand it so well. This particularly applies in Scotland, where the language is very, very close to Manx. It's much closer than Irish. Almost every year my wife and I go to Scotland, and invariably we head for the Gaelic areas, and it's amazing how you can converse with them there.
You'd be interested to know then that we've established contact with the Irish radio RTE, and
Yes,
they've agreed to take programmes from us now.
Yes, I heard that the other day. That's very interesting. Our cultural links with Ireland are completely neglected. And to a Gael, Ireland is the motherland, you see. And I was very pleased to see that.
So when you hear people speaking about, as they do, the mainland, you don't
That's
think of
right.
Liverpool then?
No, well, the mainland is Scotland, actually, because Burrowhead is 16 miles from the Point of Ayr, and that must be the mainland, and that's the nearest
Point
of Britain to us, isn't it? This mainland thing is a thing which upsets Manx patriots or nationalists, because it's used in a political sense. One never hears someone in Surrey talking about the mainland, meaning France, or Germany, or Europe too. It's a term which is used in the islands of the British Isles to denote our inferior status.
Do you think it's that, or do you think it's a term used to denote that whether it's in the British Isles or whether it's islands anywhere, that it's a small island near a bigger chunk of land?
Possibly, yes, but it seems to have a different connotation in the Isle of Man. It's a thing which grates upon many Manx people, this mainland business. Geographically, of course, it's quite correct, but people who use the term don't use it geographically at all.
Well, if we can come back now to, before our next little piece of music, back to learning the language again. You talked about teaching it to adults who are not necessarily academically inclined by, as you said, the same way as children learn to speak. What about children learning it? Young children, I mean now. Is there any signs of this in the island?
Children lap up the language very quickly. Children learn any language. In Africa, for instance, I've seen little European children speaking fluent Bantu languages, and having picked them up in a matter of weeks. There are some children being taught Manx in the island schools, but it's not on an official basis. It's simply a part-time, almost a hobby subject. And the ones that have learned it have learned very, very well indeed, extremely well.
It was put to me fairly recently that some of the requests or pressures to learn Gaelic didn't come from people like yourself, but actually came from the pupils in the schools.
Yes, they do come from the pupils, yes, yeah. And sometimes the parents don't allow them to be taught Manx. They think it's a waste of time. This is the old attitude again, you see, about the language.
Is there any merit in the argument that if a young child is spending his or her energies learning a second language, that ultimately they're going to fall slightly behind in the academic scale? This argument is prevailing obviously a lot in Canada at the moment.
Yes, it's completely wrong, this argument. I once listened to a Round Britain quiz, and it was for school children, and the winners were from Stornoway in the Isle of Lewis. Now that speaks for itself, doesn't it?
That also could speak for small communities.
All bilingual, every one of them. And bilingualism never ever harmed any child or person. It's a complete fallacy to say that, really.
Right, well, a little more music now, I think. And this particular track, a very short one on the record, I hope you'll enjoy it. It's called The Immortal Hour, or the Fairy Song. This might interest you, Dougie, because the words are, "How beautiful they are, the lordly ones, as today the only remembered music of the opera based on Celtic poems by Fiona MacLeod." And it was brought to London in 1922 from Glastonbury, where its composer, Rutland Boughton, who goes back a bit, was born in 1878 but died in 1960, had in 1914 founded an opera festival. And the very first production was this particular opera called The Immortal Hour. A rather nice piece of music, that, Dougie. Stuart Burrows there, tenor singing it. Learning music and singing Gaelic, would that be a good start to try and learn the language?
Yes, very, very. And we have a wealth of Gaelic music in the island, which, again, unfortunately, has been rather neglected. And although, of course, today there is much more interest in it than there ever was.
One lady who's been on a recording of her on this programme, indeed we broadcast a programme that she recorded at RTE in Ireland, Mona Douglas. She seems to be an indefatigable supporter of Gaelic music.
Oh, she is of everything Gaelic, yes, yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back into Gaelic music immediately here now, because this is an opportune moment. This is a recording taken at the Celtavision Song Contest, not this year, but last year, where the song came, as it were, the ordinary song joint first. The tune itself is written by a gentleman whose name by no means is Manx, Barone Giovanelli. But the words are Mona's, and it's sung on this recording, which was supplied to us by BBC Scotland, by Christine Tier.
Molas rit an tide rit ons kjold rudol jahugan fosja murna hi dar chatani havel re halison os tan kun sail shim tan echta gemachas solis immersion ist dich blaunes agnis mu estig shiljon Kirchen behelong skenja noch unser dorkos es nicht belchen kere gilach makharischen lustja
It's quite a nice song, that. Doug, I have a message whilst that was playing. A lady rang up and said, well, you said you'd take dedications, and she said, would we send kindest all the regards to John Crellin, who was on earlier on. She says, from somebody for whom he acts as a fanoddery at the bottom of her garden. And then she said, well, fanoddery does mean fairy, doesn't it? And I've got a horrible feeling it doesn't.
No, it doesn't, actually. A fanoddery is a hairy satire. A mythical person who was incidentally very helpful, because if a farmer couldn't get his hay cut because of the rain, he'd often wake up in the old days and find that Fanaudries had come in the night and cut it for him. That's if he was a good fellow.
What if he was a bad
Or if
one?
he's a bad fellow, they would do a lot of jail, as we say in Manx, a lot of damage around the place. So how John has been a Fanaudry, it's difficult to say, really.
We have to find out now. Whilst we're talking about these mythological creatures, how many of them are there? I can think of about 3 or 4, but are there a large number? Or?
Yes, there were quite a lot in the Manx, like all primitive people in their day, believed in all sorts of supernatural things. They had the Bogain, which was an evil sort of monster. They had the Fanaudry, which was the hairy satyr, who was quite helpful, and of course the fairies. But the fairies is quite a different thing. They're not the little fairies with wings and a wand that one sees in English folklore. The Manx fairies were actually, I think, a survival from the pre-Celtic inhabitants of the island.
Hence the word the little people.
The little people, that's right. And the Manx, of course, believed implicitly in fairies. Absolutely. Some even do today. But I must confess I've never seen any.
What about the fairy bridge? Is that a modern invention?
That's a modern invention, yes. The real reason for that is it goes back to Catholic days when Rushen Abbey owned all the land right up to the river at Santon there, where the big bridge is, not this little small bridge. That's only put there so the coaches can be parked peacefully without disturbing the traffic. And of course they had a Calvary there in those days. And the Manx people passing it would either pass from the church land onto the secular land or vice versa, probably raise their hats or maybe cross themselves, something like that. After the Reformation this became unfashionable, but old practice dies hard. We have a Manx saying, Manach vau cleach da ni cleach da co, which means if custom is not indulged with custom, custom will weep. And they still took their hats off where this Calvary or crucifix was, but when people said, what are you doing that for? That's not allowed today. They said, oh, I was just saying goodnight to the fairies. And that's how the legend of the fairy bridge actually originated. But it was the big bridge over the river, which is the boundary between the parish of Maloo and Santon, not that little culvert under the road, which the visitors are now happily told this is the fairy bridge, and as a matter of fact it's actually got a sign on it.
I remember reading a story written by Nigel Kneale, the chappie of the Quatermass fame, in a short storybook of his called Tomato Cane and Other Short Stories. I don't know if you read it, Doug.
I read it out in Africa. I saw it in a shop window in a place called Mufulira in Zambia, and I got it and read it there, yes.
Well, there's one story in that which always amuses me. Have I got my pronunciation right? Taruushti?
Taruushti, yes, the water bull.
There's a story in that about all these people being very worried about it and the local peddler telling them what they had to do. And indeed, all it was, in fact, although the local inhabitants would never believe it, as they lived in the north of the island, was the new foghorn installed at Whitehaven.
That's right, yes, I've read that. Yes. Oh, the Manx believed in all these things. They believed implicitly in them. And they weren't liars either. I don't know what's behind this, really. I mean, I can't say that I believe in fairies and things like that. But I've known all Manx people who were good living Christian people who swore that in their lifetime they'd seen these things. I don't know what the answer to it is. People laugh at it today. It probably is crazy. It may have been the gorse creaking in the hedge or the wind blowing in a bottle or something. You must remember in those days there was no electric light, and the only light they had was a candle in a thatched cottage. But these old people absolutely swore on their deathbed that they saw these strange things.
If you've ever walked, as I have, and I'm sure you have, out at night, maybe in the countryside, over the hills or somewhere, there are occasions when the atmosphere can be quite easy and lead your imagination into flights of fancy.
This is quite true, yes. Strangely enough, the Africans I worked with in the mines were like this as well. They believed implicitly in spirits and ghosts in the mines, and there were parts of the mine where they just wouldn't go, even if the general manager instructed them to go. They would rather get the sack first. And they did get the sack.
Well, Doug, what's the time now? Manx Radio is the station for those of you who've just tuned in. Welcome to you. We're talking to Doug Faragher, and we'll be on the air until, altogether, the whole station until midnight. We have a little more music to come up yet.
That's amazing.
Good. Well, time's catching up with us, Doug. We have not a great deal more time to go now. And we've talked about music, we've talked about all the other bits and pieces to do with Manx, we've talked about Manx people and their superstitions and everything else. Perhaps I could ask you one question which I think I already know the answer to. But if I were to say to you, what is your ambition culturally, as far as the language is concerned? Could you give me an answer to that? Do you have a time scale on it, or is it just a hope?
No, it's just a hope. My ambition would be to see a lot more Manx people with a knowledge of Manx Gaelic. That's about all we can hope for, I think. And to see as many street signs bilingual as possible, and the language used as much as possible. It's a hope, maybe a forlorn hope, but if it survives into the next century, that would be something anyway, because it was supposed to be and should have been dead about 30 years ago. But we've managed to save it, and I hope we can pass it on to a future generation.
Well, 25 years ago you started your dictionary with a hope, I presume, of that. That's a formidable task, to actually keep at writing a book for 25 years.
Yes, it is quite a task. Actually, it started as a Manx English vocabulary, because I was learning the language, and I soon realized that the existing dictionaries were inadequate. And I started collecting words from every available source, including the native speakers of the language, and putting them down in alphabetical Manx English order. But then about 10 years ago, I realized that this wasn't going to be much use to the present-day learners of the language. What they really want is an English Manx dictionary, because they want to say something in Manx and they want to look it up in an English Manx dictionary. So I sat down with the help of some friends and completely reversed all the cards I had done in Manx English into English Manx. And to give you some idea of the magnitude of the task, it took about a year to get them in alphabetical order after they were typed. And this is now, all these cards have now been retyped by me onto foolscap sheets, and the dictionary is actually virtually ready for publication. An English Manx dictionary containing a lot of modern terms which we've had to manufacture with the help of Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic. There are some 65,000 English words with their Manx equivalent, and considering the average well-spoken Englishman only uses 2,000 or 3,000 words, you can imagine the scope of it. There's so many words that I can't remember half of them myself. I can't even remember the Manx equivalent of half of them.
How do you manage for words which are new, things like television and computer and microphone, this sort of thing?
We try to use a Gaelic root for them, but of course, like English, we have to borrow. English makes words up from Greek and Latin, such as television, and we call television in Manx Chelvish. You see, they wouldn't have said television in Manx. We call it Chelvish. Our word for a motor car is glaistion, which means something which moves along. And our word for a scooter is scochen, which means something which scuds along, and so on and so forth. But these words become accepted after they're introduced to the learners of the language. In a matter of months, they become completely accepted. Like casino and things have become accepted in English.
Will your dictionary give you, in phonetics, the pronunciation of the words?
No, unfortunately it won't. That would make the cost of it absolutely prohibitive, because you'd have to use an international phonetic alphabet or some sort of imitated pronunciation. I hope when it is published that I can possibly make a tape recording of the complete work, and at least then that could be left in the museum for posterity. And the only hope for learners of the language is to join a class and learn how to pronounce the words properly. We simply couldn't do it.
One thing I notice in listening to you is that you have a soft way of speaking, It's similar, very similar to many people I hear speaking Irish, but a lot of people I've heard speaking Manx Gaelic, other than you, seem to get a very hard tone to their voice, almost an unnatural flow to
Yes,
it.
they do. They think, some of them, that you have to be very sort of garu, as we say in Manx, very rough when you're speaking the language. Actually, Gaelic is a very soft, gentle language, very easily taken up by a Manx person, because our voices are naturally fitted into it. For the language, you would make a Manx speaker yourself.
I might even take you
Because
up on that.
your voice lends itself to Gaelic.
Well, I'm not going to try to lend my voice at this time on a Sunday night, nearly Monday morning, to Gaelic, Doug, but perhaps before we part company, would you like to send a message to any of your Gaelic-speaking friends, whether they're Manx, Irish, Scottish, or where they may be?
Bavaliam the Moor Lotrish Namanani Rish Tamok Beg Adson as Gilgoxon for the Welsh Geistach Runan Shawnach. Tamish Gaski is Tammy Bonus Shiga the Velrory a hidden Gaski, Tantre Bonus Ekmeni. Then you know Faust the Macree the Ve Lotrish Rory and Shaw and McKeown Ruthen Kelchach as Ruthen Gilgach. As Bavaliam Grey Rish Namanani Olio, Evi as Cadler Souche tre Vishun and Lai Nacht. As Gusna Ernie Bavaliam Grey Ikawa agus Gusna Albany and Snelban Ikawa.
Well, thank you, Doug. We've been talking to Dougie Faragher, who, as you may have gathered by his closing remarks, is a Manx Gaelic expert. I'm sure Doug would be delighted if anybody listening in this evening has any queries at all about the language, or would like to know further about courses, anything at all about it, then please do write into us. The address is Manx Radio, Broadcasting House, Douglas Head, Douglas, Isle of Man. Manx Radio, Broadcasting House, Douglas Head, Douglas, Isle of Man. And we'll pass your mail on to Doug as it comes in. Thank you for coming along, Doug.
Shade the Way. You're welcome.